The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that results from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Max George.
I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
What's in my podcast? This is an exciting episode. I've been waiting for this moment for a very long time, Nathaniel.
Me too. I honestly am surprised we actually haven't done this one sooner. People probably don't know this about us, but we have a great, deep, abiding love for the Mothman. You know, that glowy-eyed flying boy.
And I think later on in the podcast, we can kind of talk about why we love him so much. Because I always tell people he's my favorite cryptozoid of them all. Over Chupacabra, over Bigfoot, over Loch Ness, over Jersey Devil. Like, Mothman.
Dang.
Mothman is number one.
Of all the cryptids, wow.
So it's going to be an action-packed episode. I think we've done our research on not only this urban legend, but the story that affected Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We read a book. We've watched the movie. We have a guest interview. It's going to be an amazing episode. And if you love the Mothman, you're just going to get all of your needs met here.
Yeah, that wasn't an uncomfortable way to phrase that at all.
Let me take a drink.
That sounds... You needed to rehydrate after that? Ugh.
Exactly. Yep, it's the Mothman. He gets me excited. Oh, we're going to have to put a disclaimer on this episode.
Yeah, this is definitely getting an explicit tag just from this intro.
All right, Nathaniel, I think we should just dive in, feet forward. Feet first, feet forward. What's the cliche? Let's talk about the Mothman. So
what is this Mothman?
Mothman definitely, I think, falls into a little bit of my occult corner. He's not occult in any which way, but of course my occult corner deals with urban legends and cryptozoids and all sorts of kind of the supernatural and the paranormal. And the Mothman, to me, is kind of the golden standard when it comes to cryptozoid sightings. So the story goes, from November 1966 to November 1967, there was this creature that was seen multiple times by multiple different people to be this kind of humanoid figure with these huge wings. And the main feature that most people would remember, of course, are these glowing red eyes.
And I have information about that, but we'll get back to that.
So technically the first sighting was on November 12th. There were 5 men who were digging a grave at a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, and they see this creature, and of course they have no idea what's going on. And the weird thing, though, is, Nathaniel, 3 days later, there's a car incident where this couple and some friends were driving on the road, and all of a sudden they see this thing, and they describe it as a humanoid figure with a probably 10 feet tall with this giant wingspan and these glowing red eyes. And it's chasing them. It's not just appearing. It's not like a orb or a UFO. It's actively pursuing the car. And something that they are very keen to note is this was close to a World War II site, a bombing site. Excuse me, not a bombing site. It was a TNT area, a site of a former World War II munitions plant, to be a little bit more specific there. And after November 15th of 1966, lots of people saw this creature. It wasn't just these 2 incidents. The town of Point Pleasant, people have said, was haunted by sightings of the Mothman. That's kind of the coined term they gave this creature. because of the wingspan, the big glowing red bug eyes, and people.
And also, like, they were comparing him to Batman. Like, Batman was a popular comic book at this point in time, and they said it was kind of like Batman, but maybe a little bit more, I don't know, mothy, and then Mothman stuck.
And I mean, moths are gross as is, so magnify it by 10, and it would scare anybody.
Or at least eat your sweater.
There you go. An alien that only cares about your sweaters. The big
so that's what you think he is?
Well, we'll get to that, Nathaniel. You got ants in your pants, you got moth in your pants. See what I did there? So the ultimate story of the Mothman, and essentially why he became famous, is in November of 1967, so approximately a year after the first sightings, there was a collapse of the Silver Bridge, which connected West Virginia to Ohio. And this bridge collapse ultimately killed quite a few people, 46 people in total.
And this was, of course, right after the Mothman had been seen on that bridge. And so he started to be perceived as this, like, omen or harbinger of death, and that maybe all those appearances were some sort of warning up until that point.
Exactly. And the day of the Silver Bridge collapse, several people said that they saw him flying over the bridge or on one of the supporting beams of the bridge. Again, the interesting thing with Mothman to me is it's not just 3 people who are out in the middle of the desert drunk who see the chupacabra and that's what we have to go on. It was a whole city over a year, multiple sightings, and then this very big event happens where people die. It's kind of hard to rationalize that a little bit, especially for those people living in Point Pleasant. I imagine they felt that this was all very, very real, and they were almost under attack. So that's kind of the main story of the Mothman. There have been other sightings, which I'm less keen to believe. In 1999, there were some Russian ufologists who thought that he was seen right before the Russian apartment bombings. In 2016, WCHS TV published a photo, and I'm doing air quotes because, this is a visual podcast. They purported this image to be the Mothman, but then when zoologists were asked to look at the photo, they were like, oh yeah, this is X and X bird, and it's carrying a snake. It was very obvious. Then most recently that I'm aware of, and Nathaniel, you mentioned this, was in 2017, 55 people around the Chicago area claimed to see him. So those, I think, are a little less authentic to me. Nathaniel, I was listening to a conspiracy theory podcast last week in preparation for this movie, and they even went as far as comparing Mothman to the Ocular Man, who is a very well-known kind of image from the Nazca lines, kind of supporting the alien theory. And again, there are so many cryptids out there that you could kind of correlate with Mothman. Owlman, the Popobawa, Spring-Heeled Jack, even the Jersey Devil. There's a lot, and I think before we kind of dive into the book and the movie, I just kind of wanted to go over a few of the different theories that people have about what Mothman is. Of course, you have your theories that think that he is a cryptozoid. That would be some sort of weird bird insect hybrid that somehow brings a warning of danger or death. Animals have been known to kind of freak out whenever a natural disaster is about to hit. Unfortunately, my pet betta fish, Steve, did not warn me about the Utah earthquake in March. We're fighting over that.
Yeah, that was fun.
It's a very tender subject. So there's that theory, but also I think the more kind of common and agreed upon amongst cryptozoologists would be that either he is an alien, and there was a lot of stories before Mothman was even seen about these weird, Men in Black visiting Point Pleasant and kind of this alien-esque storytelling going on in the area before Mothman even came. So a lot of people think he was a alien pet that may have escaped, or he was an alien himself. People also think he's a demon, because whenever anything bad happens, my buddies get the blame. I don't think he's a demon, but a lot of people do. Other theory that I think is actually pretty substantial would be that he is either some new scientific research that came out of the World War II compounds that were in the area. So maybe humans were testing out a jetpack or night vision or something of that nature.
A glider, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Or that he was a mutant, that something happened with Nazi science that America's clearly involved with, and he was some sort of weird chimera of a human mixed with a bird or a whatever. That aspect of the theory gets a little crazy. And then, of course, there's this idea that Point Pleasant just kind of went through this cultural zeitgeist with the Mothman, that I'm a very firm believer that there's a universal subconscious, and if enough people start talking about one thing, that no matter who you are, you might start subconsciously believing in this, and then your brain will start to manifest it for you. Not because you're actually seeing it, but because there is a very primal need to fit in with a community. So if your entire city is claiming they're seeing the Mothman, and you want to see the Mothman so bad, you might start seeing the Mothman. And then finally, which is really probably the only real theory, is it was a bird.
Yep.
A large owl or some sort of heron. And that makes the most sense, honestly, which Occam's razor tells us that the simplest outcome is the most likely, and that's probably what it is. So there we go.
And along those lines, typically when it's depicted in stuff by artists, we have those red glowing eyes. The interesting thing is that really that mostly comes down to kind of like a secondhand account of the Mothman, that someone mentions glowing red eyes. Most people actually in their original reports said that if they like shined a light at it or something like that, then they saw the eyes reflect back. And it was often compared to like bicycle reflectors or things like that. So to me, that says the glowing red eyes is kind of what has gotten into the popular zeitgeist, but isn't necessarily actually what people were encountering. And yeah, like a lot of animals, like birds and cats and stuff, will have, a certain layer in their eyes that makes it reflect like it does to light. And so, yeah, that makes sense that it would be a bird and would, reflect in a very piercing, creepy looking way. But I mean, anyone who has seen a cat when you're driving around out in the middle of the night or something like that knows how eerie that looks. So, if that's up in the air just a little bit above you, yeah, that's pretty scary. And yeah, like there's some really freaking big birds out there, like condors. I don't think it was a condor necessarily, but it could be a pretty good sized wingspan bird that was, or just going through the area over a year and then moved on. Yeah, people would think that, especially if it's flying low enough, people could very well think that it was this Mothman. So that is really interesting.
And when we kind of wrap up the episode, I really want to kind of dissect why we love the Mothman story so much, and why I think he's lasted this long.
Yeah.
But to stay on track, Nathaniel, Mr. Literary Philosopher English Major,
English teacher.
Talk to us about that too, I guess. Talk to us about the Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. This was a kind of the book that inspired the movie.
Yes, and we might want to use inspired fairly loosely here, as it turns out.
Very all capitalized.
Yes. Okay, so the Mothman Prophecies is by John Keel, who was a pretty prominent ufologist, especially during this era. So, in the 60s when all of the stuff that happened in Point Pleasant happened. He heard that there was some interesting activity going on. He went down, he had to check it out because he's a ufologist. That's what he does. So the book is really kind of him laying out a lot of the weird stuff that was going on in Point Pleasant around this period of time, and shares some of his theories of what he thought was going on. I've read a number of books by ufologists, most of which have been very kind of kooky and unconvincing in their arguments about UFOs and aliens and all sorts of stuff. But in this case, I found that the way that the book was written was much more convincing and fact focused than a lot of other books along those lines, which I found refreshing personally. Did you feel that way as well?
Yeah, actually, I thought kind of the fragmented story by story, it almost felt like journal entries in some regard.
Yeah.
And that kind of embellishment of the story made it feel a lot more realistic and authentic. And almost gave it a scientific kind of a feel. It felt like a biologist in the wild kind of collecting all of these stories and then making his assumption.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what John Keel was intending to do, was to try to collect these stories in a way that was kind of proving that there is much more in the universe, and much more visiting Earth than we necessarily officially know about as humans. And so this was definitely a piece of nonfiction where he was trying to collect reports from people and posit his theories based on those reports.
And just to piggyback off of you one more time, I think that's how you tell a story like this. We often hear alien abduction stories, or hell, even demonic possession stories or ghost hauntings, and it feels so dramatized, fabricated, fantastical. It's very clear that there's embellishment going on.
Mm-hmm.
And in John Keel's book, I kind of got bored occasionally, not because that the content was boring, but just it felt like I was almost reading a scientific journal.
Yeah.
And that, I think, lends to some of the credibility of the Mothman, and we can get to this later, but I was really impressed with how it was presented. I didn't feel like I was reading some guy's UFO story just trying to get famous,
Yeah, for sure. And like, I think along those lines, this is just one of a number of books that John Keel wrote based on investigations he did, kind of all over the country as a ufologist. And also, I just think that it's really interesting because, for a book called The Mothman Prophesies, Mothman really isn't that present in the book. He certainly kind of starts out talking about, this cryptid and a lot of the weird stuff around the Mothman. But he very quickly goes into a lot of the other stuff that he started to hear about around town. There were many instances of people who were, approached by strange men in black suits. The kind of stereotypical men in black from the government who come in and just tell them, like, hey, stop talking about the weird thing that you saw, and then leaving. There were instances where people were meeting these very peculiar people who would like come and visit and just talk about weird stuff and like not really sound even like fully human, and then just leave. And there's like, who was that person? Like, why were they there? Like, why did they come to our house? There was a lot of stories, and a lot of those things end up kind of being played with a little bit in the movie. But to me, I think the most notable one was the number of instances where there is a certain man who is interacting with basically an alien, for lack of a better term, who's going by Indrid Cole.
Yes, Indrid Cole. You can't have the Mothman without Indrid Cole. They go very hand in hand, and this goes back to what I was talking about. At Point Pleasant had a lot of this weird activity going on before Mothman even came around.
Yes. And so, Indrid Cole is, regularly contacting this one guy, and he's telling him lots of information about the universe. He even allegedly like took him on like little rides around on in a spaceship, all sorts of interesting stuff. And it seemed like Indrid Cole was kind of out. He and like was seen by multiple people. Most people just saw him from a distance, but then he just kind of really palled around with one guy in particular. And so the book really kind of digs into that. It doesn't necessarily spell out, who this, being is exactly. It definitely posits some theories. Then, there's also like other people other entities that were working with Indrid Cold. Something I found interesting because I was looking it up, the name Cold for like an alien encounter, as being used as a last name is actually really common. People kind of throughout the world who have claimed to have had alien encounters where they had discussions with the aliens and the aliens introduced themselves. A fair number of them have said that the being used the name Cold. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I have not heard that before. That is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I was trying to see if it had any meaning or whatever, just because it's an unusual name. To say the least. And yeah, that's kind of what So there was a lot of stuff going on in Point Pleasant. One critique I do have of the book is that you kind of, it's pretty clear that John Keel expects you to have a certain amount of knowledge of ufology going in, or at least to accept the idea or a lot of kind of basic ideas of ufology. He would reference some kind of more intensive, hardcore conspiracy ufology stuff as if it was just like an established fact. And I didn't love that was kind of the base point from which I should be jumping off and kind of looking at all of the other stuff that happened, that he chronicles in the Mothman Prophecies. Because to me, that was kind of too far out of a place to have as my starting point.
Yeah, kind of written by a ufologist for ufologists on behalf of all ufologists.
Felt like his intent was to try to persuade the public that all of this stuff was going on and that we should be paying more attention to it. But if your base point is not the layperson, but rather someone of at least moderate ufology experience, to me, that's you're not going to succeed at your goal as well as you would otherwise. So that was interesting to just kind of notice throughout. Yeah, I felt like he was very eager to accept the more radical possible explanations of everything, which is fine. Obviously, like that's he's dedicated a lot of his life to chasing after weird things that happen in the world. It seems natural that he would want to have a certain level of kind of, I guess, wonder in the world, for lack of other way to phrase it. But yeah, I just felt like there was sometimes much more accessible explanations that he would only briefly nod at if he referenced them at all, which I think was unfortunate because I feel like even with rational explanations for a lot of the stuff, there were still some really weird things that happened, like phone calls that would just like persistently harass certain people over and over and over again, like phone calls just at random times of the day, all day, every day, and they would change their number and it would suddenly start happening again, like stuff like that was really weird. I was super interested in that, and I was like, man, that would be a really weird thing and really awful thing to happen. There's just a lot to unpack. I definitely recommend it for anyone who is interested in cryptids or ufology or things like that. I think it's an interesting book, and it definitely presents a lot of interesting information, even if it doesn't necessarily come to the conclusions I think it should necessarily come to.
I think it's a good jumping off point, though, where we can move from book to movie. So the book was written in 1975, and the movie was released in 2002. So about 27 years in between the two. The movie opened up a lot of tourism, I think, to Point Pleasant. When the movie dropped, the city actually started its very first Mothman Festival. And it really kind of became another cultural icon in our community, weirdly enough.
What are you doing here?
Somehow between 1 and 2:30, I traveled 400 miles. I've got no memory.
Past few months, people have been coming up to me and reporting strange things.
In 2002, Nathaniel, you and I were 12 years old. This is a movie that is fairly new.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it in the movie theater and watching it with you in college. It's something that hasn't been around that long, but again, I think kind of made a fairly good impact on cinema and the horror community and really our culture, because again, Mothman is high up there among other cryptozoids like Bigfoot and Chupacabra, where people know who he is now. It's not this isolated event that happened in Point Pleasant, and I think a lot of that comes from the movie. So the director of Mothman Prophecies is Mark Pellington, and the writers were actually Richard Hatem and John Keel. He helped actually write the movie. The three kind of stars of the movie are our dear Richard.
Let me clarify. It looks like that they credited him just because he wrote the novel, but actually Richard Hatem did the whole screenplay.
Oh, excuse me. Good catch. So the three stars of the movie, we've got Richard Gere. Love him. He plays John Klein. Nice little change there from John Keel, the author of the book. Deborah Messing from Will and Grace fame plays Mary Klein, his wife. And then we have Laura Linney plays Connie Mills, who's kind of the main detective / cop of Point Pleasant, helping Richard Gere kind of figure out what's going on.
It's Richard Gere?
Greer. Ugh. It's one of those names I cannot say without saying it wrong.
It's Gere. Gere.
Ugh. So the movie, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, is vastly different than what you find in John Keel's book. It is very inspired on the events that he wrote about. However, of course, Hollywood kind of had to create a narrative around the events. And so there's, for me at least, it's a lot more supernatural and darker, quote unquote. I wouldn't call it a dark movie, but they kind of create this Mothman figure to be very nefarious and have a very strong kind of purpose in the movie. If that makes sense.
See, I'm actually not 100% convinced of that. And we can kind of get into it a little bit more, but should we maybe just kind of hit the main story notes before we jump in more of what worked and what didn't, and kind of how Mothman played into it? Okay, so basically what we have is that John Klein and his wife Mary are kind of out one night. They're in their home. They live in New Jersey, something like that. They're driving home one night. They see a weird flash of something fly over them. It makes them end up crash or get in a car wreck. His wife definitely saw something. He's not sure what he saw. And then shortly after that, they find out that she has a brain tumor. She is dying. She ends up dying in the first kind of act of the movie. Then kind of it fast forwards about a year or so, and by the way, John Klein is a newspaper reporter, and then he starts hearing a little bit about this Mothman, and this has been on his mind because as his wife was dying, she drew all these weird pictures that looks like the Mothman, and some people are like, oh, it's angels, but it looks kind of a little bit too freaky for angels, and so that kind of gets his.
Also, no one who has ever drawn anything in this kind of a setting is it angels. The pictures they always draw are very dark and spooky and crazy, and I love it. I'm sorry.
She's drawing angels. It looks like it is literally like consuming something as it bursts out of hell. But whatever.
And very dark bat-like wings, giant red eyes, very satanic, and it's angels.
Yeah, it looks like it should be on like a black metal album cover.
Exactly.
But anyway, regardless of people's claims that angels look like that, apparently so that's got his interest, and so he starts hearing a little bit of stuff about like, hey, there's some weird stuff over in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and then like one night he is driving his car. He's supposed to be driving to meet with, I think, the governor of West Virginia or something. But then he just like ends up on the opposite side of the state in Point Pleasant, just kind of by happenstance. His car breaks down. He goes to this house. The people there are being very hostile towards him, and they're like, "You've been at our house every night for like 3 or 4 nights, and it's in the middle of the night." And they start pointing a gun at him. A cop shows up to help defuse the situation, which is Laura Linney's character. And then he ends up getting to a motel, and he's like, I don't even know how I got here. It doesn't even make like possible, like it's not even possible for me to have traveled this distance in that amount of time. So he's freaked out. He ends up sticking around town and starts to kind of dig around and starts to hear more about people sighting the Mothman, and also the weird guy who pointed a gun at him, who is played by Will Patton. The character's name is Gordon Smallwood. He has seen some weird stuff, and also he started being contacted by this entity called Indrid Cold. So he's kind of playing that character from the book. Then not that much happens, honestly. Lots of investigating,
Yeah.
lots of like just kind of weird, spooky moments, but nothing that concrete happens. We have John Klein go and talk to someone, and then like it will like have a brief flash of Mothman, but it's like literally like a tenth of a second on the screen, and then it's supposed to make us jump and go, oh, that would have been freaky to see whatever that was jump out of your tree or whatever. We kind of hear a watered down version of the story of the kids in their car, which is kind of the most famous Mothman story other than the bridge one. Oh, and by the way, all of this is like modernized. Like this is as if it was happening, in the 90s, not in, or, like late 90s, early 2000s, not in the 60s, like in the book. Then basically, one night, Gordon calls John and at the motel and is like, he's here with me. He wants to talk to you. Indrid Cold wants to talk to you. And then it's like this really weird layered voice. That's actually where we got our quote from the beginning, is that, Indrid Cold starts telling him things that he shouldn't be able to know. And that includes, just to kind of test him, he's like, what's in my, or what book do I have on my nightstand? And he tells him what book it is, and then he starts like looking around, like, is he seeing me throughout the window? And he like hides his hand in the dresser after pulling something out of his pocket, and he's like, what's in my hand? Chapstick. He opens it up, and it's chapstick, and it's all spooky, which is the only time that the word chapstick has been spooky ever, and it makes me giggle incessantly.
And I think right there, though, Nathaniel, plot points aside, is the movie, what it does right is it does feel very ominous and very creepy. Like, it takes the word chapstick and definitely spins it in a way that not only makes you giggle, but also is a little unsettling.
Yeah.
It's not visceral horror by any means. Even the few jump scares that they do with the Mothman, it is definitely more kind of like a drama, crime, kind of figuring out Scooby-Doo-esque what is the Mothman.
Yeah, what is the Mothman? What is Indrid Cold? Are they the same being? Are they different beings? In fact, that was actually something that I wanted to ask you. When you watched the movie, especially the first time, did you think that the Mothman was Indrid Cold?
No. And I don't think they're the same person, but I can see where you're coming from, for sure.
Upon rewatch, I realized that's probably not the intent. But the first time I watched it, I thought that he was talking to the Mothman on the phone. Like, I didn't realize that there's supposed to be multiple entities at work. And so I don't feel like it necessarily does the best job of kind of fleshing that out of like, hey, there's a lot of weird crap going on in Point Pleasant, not just the Mothman. So I think it could definitely play that up a little bit more.
I personally love the theory that Mothman is actually Indrid Cold's pet that escaped from some sort of UFO, and so Indrid is trying to investigate and figure out where his little Mothman went. I don't know, I just think it's a charming kind of play on the story.
Yeah, kind of jumping back to the plot of the movie. So there's also this kind of like vague half love story thing going on. It's not super lovey-dovey.
Yeah.
Basically just like, maybe it's a love story, maybe it's just like a good friendship between John and the cop, Laura Linney's cop character, Connie. She's helping him out, helping him kind of navigate and break down some barriers with people who saw things and who reported them to her. And then he ends up leaving for some reason, just to like go home because it's just all too much for him and he's thinking too much about his wife or something like that. And then she calls him and is like, you should come have Christmas dinner with me. And it's at that, basically he is driving back and he's like, yeah, I should. And then that's when the bridge collapses, and of course they're both on it when it happens, and they barely escape, and it's all dramatic. Roll credits. It's an interesting movie. I like it.
Overall, I think acting is pretty superb. And
I will say that it was solid, except I didn't like Will Patton's acting. I felt like his take on, weird guy who's being contacted by an alien was a little bit too spaced out for me. I don't know.
And kind of cliched. Very, very cliched in my
opinion.
Yeah,
I think that's fair. Is that he felt like he was playing a caricature of, that type of character from other things, when everything else, like, I don't know, the rest of the approach to it seemed much more kind of grounded in reality. And so him just going, he spoke to me and came down. I don't know, it sounded a little bit too much, stoner in the desert. And I don't know, just like he's too good of an actor for him to be that ridiculous in that role, I thought. So that was a shame. But I agree that the rest of the acting was good.
And to clarify, and I want to clarify earlier when I mentioned that I think Mothman is kind of more of a prominent theme in this. The show itself, the movie doesn't actually, we never see Mothman fully. It's always in little snippets or remembering or kind of flashbacks. There's no actual moment where we see who Mothman is or what he is, which I appreciate, because a lot of monster movies just show us the monster, and once we see the monster, we're not afraid anymore. What I meant by he's kind of more of a prominent figure is I feel like the movie's entitled Mothman Prophecies. I feel like the driving plot of the film is about this entity that people are seeing. And it does have, I think, a very kind of nefarious tone to it. This is a bad Mothman. He's doing bad things. And then at the end, it results in the collapse of Silver Bridge. And that's kind of what I was getting at. Which is true to the real Mothman story in some regard. He was an ominous figure who brought upon calamity.
See, and to me, and this is both, I think, true of the book and the movie. I don't think that, like, the bridge collapsing is his fault or anything. I think, honestly, and I felt like this was true, but in the movie as well, that, like, he just kind of just does his own thing. Like, he's just flying around, he's just looking around, just doing his own thing. And then people see him and get freaked out because he's freaky looking, obviously. Big, glowy, scary man, and they like gave him like a freaky mouth and everything in the movie too. But like, I think he's just like passing by, and people are like, "Holy crap, there's a monster!" And I don't know. I felt like most of the times when he showed up, it was random and didn't have any necessarily meaning, like in any meaning to it. And it wasn't until we have some sightings of him on the bridge that he seems like some sort of foreboding thing. And in fact, to me, I felt like Indrid Cold and a lot of his vague warnings about something bad going to happen, and the numbers that he's spouting and all of that. To me, he seemed more of like a nefarious character, because it seemed like he was providing information about some sort of awful disaster that was going to happen, but not enough to actually do anything about it. So to me, Indrid Cold is much more of a sinister figure than the Mothman. The Mothman's just kind of doing his own thing. It's kind of how I see it.
Do you think then it's circumstantial that whenever the Mothman is, take the bridge, for example, the Mothman was just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Well, I mean, I think it's just that, like yeah, maybe he's drawn to the bad thing that's going to happen, the energy that's there or something like that. But I don't think that he is causing anything. I think he's just, like he's hanging out maybe in places where something bad's going to happen. But to be fair, he also just kind of shows up in random other places around town. It honestly seems more circumstantial than anything.
Let's talk about some of the other plot points that maybe we weren't huge on. The movie itself is honestly kind of boring and is a very, very slow burn. Like you mentioned in your quick plot synopsis, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, like I definitely agree. It's a movie where I felt drawn through it, multiple times that I've watched it. I enjoy sitting down and watching the movie, but it is slower paced for sure. There's not a lot of action. Almost anything that's interesting that happened in the past. It's people telling John about what happened to them, and like that's cool and that's interesting. But yeah, there's very little that's actually like present threat, present danger, present anything. And so yeah, it just kind of really slows everything down because we don't have a character getting chased or anything like that. Like it's not until the bridge collapses that anything actually really happens to him directly.
And on top of that, it is a pretty cheesy vibe to a lot of the scenes. It almost feels kind of like a cheesy detective show that you'll see on cable sometimes. But again, it's fun, and there's something about it that does draw you in. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite movies, but I thoroughly enjoy The Mothman. I've watched it multiple times, and as we know, I can talk about it non-stop. There is something about the story that I think kind of drags people in regardless.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the cheese really just comes from like it's inherently a kind of a ridiculous idea. And like I felt like they did a good job of
Right.
kind of giving it the gravitas of kind of what that real life experience is of like if you see something weird in the woods, even though it's silly to say it was a Mothman, it still would freak you out, right? And so I feel like it has to balance that, and it is very much a horror movie that was packaged as a thriller for the biggest audience possible. It's PG-13, and so I felt like a certain level of cheese is just gonna be there with any Mothman story, and yeah, like ultimately, it's just not very scary because that's not going to be the big crowd pleaser, especially around this period of time when this movie came out. Like any safe mass market horror that wasn't more of a niche kind of thing was they tended to play it very safe, a little bit cheesy, and it made decent money. So yeah, so it didn't have to be scary, and I'm glad that they didn't over dramatize the story that much to make it super freaky. It's just a creepy movie throughout the whole thing.
And I think another aspect to this is the 90s. When we look at horror in the 90s, and I think we should probably do an episode on this eventually, Nathaniel, we were coming out of a golden age of horror in the 80s. The 90s and early 2000s, there's something that was missing almost. And I think you made a good point when a lot of the horror movies that I can recall that were made in this time, Twister, Mothman, they were PG-13 to reach a larger audience. When back in the 80s and early 70s, they just didn't care. They were making these slasher movies and they were very almost progressive for the time. And so there is this kind of weird disconnect. It feels very
Sterile.
90s. Yes, great word. But again, the story I think is so universal. We've all been camping in the woods and we think we see something that, scares our pants off. And then our brains start to kind of cyclic think and create this narrative that probably never really ever happened. We heard a leaf fall off a tree and now we think it's the Mothman. And so I think that speaks to a lot of people. You have a note here that you don't love that they modernized it for the 2000s. Do you want to make mention of that real quick?
So just to me, I didn't love that they set the story of the film in 2000-ish. Like to me, that didn't actually contribute anything to the movie, and really just made it kind of baffling to me when I actually started looking into the real story about the Silver Bridge and all that. It didn't make sense that they would just move it forward 40 years when that doesn't. To me, you modernize a movie if you're going to do something that is different, that is fresh, that is unique, that you can only do with like modern technology or things like that. In this case, it just, if anything, I felt like it kind of inhibited the story because they then had to try to play around with cell phones and things like that it just kind of overcomplicated the plot in some ways. When if they had just set it in the 60s, when all of this stuff actually happened, it would have been so much more grounded in the things that were happening and the mentality of the time and all of that. I don't know. It didn't contribute. If anything, I felt like it took away from some of the potential storytelling elements.
And I think honestly, at the end of the day, it would have benefited from being almost a mockumentary based on John Keel's book, instead of trying to force this narrative that really didn't happen fully. So anyway, bygones be bygones. When it comes to screams, Nathaniel, what do you give it?
Oh, 2.
Yeah, I gave it a 2 as well. It's not scary. It's very tense, dramatic. There are a few jump scares, but other than that, it's very tame. Very tame. Sterile. I like that word.
Mm-hmm. What do you give it as far as crowns?
I gave it a 6. I feel like we've ragged on it a little bit over the last few minutes, but again, I come back to this movie again and again, not because I think it's a work of art and, the best movie ever. It's no Hereditary, but there's a nostalgia to it, and again, I think it speaks to a lot of those universal feelings we have all had when we're out in the wilderness and we think we hear or we think we see something. And I don't know, it draws you in, and it's powerful in that regard.
Yeah, I give it a 6 as well, pretty much for the same reasons. I enjoy the film. I own it. I mean, but I guess to be fair though, I bought my copy from a thrift store. So yeah, I like it. It's fun. I'll visit it again at some point. But it's not like a must watch every year kind of movie. It's every decade or so I'll go, oh yeah, Mothman. Yeah, and then I watch it. All right. Well, should we move on to our very special interview?
Yes, I'm very excited for this interview. I have a coworker who one day we were just chatting about who knows what, and she suddenly drops that her husband served a religious mission in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And I heard that, and I kind of lost my brain a little bit. Freaked out, asked her if he knew anything about the Mothman, and she quickly texted him, and the answer is yes. And it's the closest I've come to Point Pleasant and actually being where the Mothman stuff happened. So I think without further ado, we can play this interview with Jordan. He's going to talk to us about kind of his experience in the area and talking to people who are alive during the Mothman situation, and then also the amazing Mothman Festival that started in 2002. All right, Jordan Runyon, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you mind just kind of explaining to our audience who you are, a little bit what you do, kind of your profession, just kind of give them some flavors of who this crazy person is who knows a lot about the Mothman?
Oh, yeah, I know some for sure. But yeah, I'm a software developer by trade. I went to the University of Utah studying game development and got my degree in that. And right now I work for company called R. Donnelly, where we do application development for our clients when they bring in their requests for massive jobs of whether it's like bank statements or notices or invoices or checks, like the kind of mail that's actually important, not junk mail. We take all that kind of information and process it and then print it, and we handle that whole workflow. So I do the app development for that. So that's kind of what I do during the day.
Me and my co-host Nathaniel, we're huge gamers, so you having a degree in game development is gonna make us drool a little bit. Do you have a favorite video game
Of like all time? I would say like
yes.
I would say like the Metroid series
All right.
is one of my all-time favorites.
Cool.
Growing up playing like Super Metroid and looking forward to Metroid Prime 4 if it ever happens.
Yeah, we'll see. COVID may have other plans for us. I am terrible at first-person shooters and side-scroller shooters, so I love the Metroid series, but I've actually never played them from start to finish because I give up and rage quit.
They do have a difficulty curve that takes some learning, but
Well, I know you kind of tangentially. I worked with your wife at the research company that I'm still with, and it was kind of fun because one day I was talking about the podcast and this crazy show that I love a lot, Mothman Prophecies, and how a lot of the Mothman sightings were originated in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and she got really excited and really animated and told me that you actually spent some time there, and you'll have to talk to her after we were done recording because I lost my marbles a little bit when I found that out. So we're really excited to kind of hear some stories from someone who's actually been there. But before we dive into that, Jordan, whenever we have a guest on the podcast, we love to ask them about scary movies. That's kind of the bread and butter of this podcast. So do you have a favorite scary / horror movie / suspense / slasher, whatever horror means to you?
I haven't seen a whole lot of scary or horror films in my day, but there are a couple that stand out to me. My favorite that I enjoyed and watched with friends. I don't know if you've ever heard of Darkness Falls, but it's
it's so good.
It was fun because we literally made fun of it almost the whole time in kind of an ironic perspective, because it's literally the tooth fairy that everyone's afraid of. And
yeah,
so
it's
was
definitely
easy to poke
kind
fun
of a twist on the whole, tooth fairy kind of a thing.
Yeah, so it was kind of easy to poke fun at and not be completely just scared out of my mind. But it had some good jump scares and things like that. Yeah, that I would say that's probably my favorite that I can remember.
Okay. So now let's dive a little bit deeper. What's the scariest horror movie you think you've ever seen? One that you can't poke fun of because it's too terrifying.
I'm just gonna call out an old classic, Jaws.
That scene where they see the corpse under the water is just so terrifying still.
Yeah, or just the opening scene with the girl in the water.
Oh, totally.
Where she's just swimming. Freaks me out.
We have not covered Jaws actually on this podcast, and I think we need to. It's such a great movie and an iconic horror film.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so let's cut the crap, Jordan. Let's talk about the Mothman.
Sounds good.
All right. Tell us a little bit about why you were in Point Pleasant. You're from originally Utah, right?
Yeah, more or less. I've lived here the greater portion of my life, I suppose. But I was in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, because I was serving an LDS mission for 2 years in the West Virginia area. And I was in Point Pleasant for about 4 months. And so that was the reason I was there, kind of to give some context.
Okay. And I know some of our listeners might not be familiar with LDS missions, but you're essentially in a certain area for about 2 years, kind of sharing the gospel of the LDS faith and really kind of bunkering down and getting to know the people and the culture. Correct?
Correct. And we definitely get a full dose of the culture while we're there. And Point Pleasant was no exception.
I bet. Can you kind of go into a little bit about the culture and the demographics? If you could describe what the city of Point Pleasant is like to somebody, what would you describe it as?
Yeah, so it's actually a really interesting geographic location because Point Pleasant is right on the Ohio River, on the border between West Virginia and Ohio. Right across the river is Gallipolis, Ohio. And there's a bridge, a new bridge. We'll talk about we'll talk about the old bridge in a minute. There's a new bridge, really nice bridge, goes across between the two cities. And Point Pleasant, it has some really interesting history behind it back in the Revolution and the American Revolution times, where they built a bunker on this point. And there's this giant mural around the flood wall that borders the town and the river, and it has this massive mural depicting the kind of the colonists meeting and even fighting with Native Americans in that area. It's amazing. This mural is just so detailed. It was really, really cool. We definitely went there just a couple times, took pictures, and just looked at it and walked around. Really cool historic location.
That's awesome. That sounds very like Parks and Rec Pawnee-esque, all those crazy murals that they have in the city building. And as far as the people go, was it a kind of a wealthy area, more on the impoverished side?
It was definitely a less wealthy area. A lot of West Virginia, I'm not going to say it's like really poor, but it definitely is on the lower income side of things, especially because of just kind of the history of the state. West Virginia used to be a very wealthy state in the kind of mid 1800s when coal was really valuable and the whole country ran on it. I think there's a city called Welch, West Virginia. It was the second largest / wealthiest city in America next to New York at the time. Now it's a ghost town. So kind of a lot of the state has kind of reverted and is in this kind of state of unending, not poverty, but just kind of trying to catch back up because they fell into this recession because coal was no longer as important and as wealth generating for the state anymore. And that was their whole industry. So Point Pleasant is kind of part of all of that.
So were the people that you were interacting with on a daily basis, did you find that they were very religious, very conservative, very kind of traditional in their beliefs? Did you see a lot of that when you were over there? Was it, I just kind of want to paint a picture of the superstition of people. Were they very kind of right-wing Christians, or were there some kind of oddballs here and there? And I use that term with delicacy, oddball.
Well, in Point Pleasant, it's kind of interesting because you have Ohio. So there's some influence from the Ohio side of things, which isn't very similar to like the Deep South stereotype, but you still have the West Virginia side of things. And so there are people who are very, very passionate about their beliefs. And then you have people who just don't really care or don't really see the point or don't see the relevance to religion in general. But there are definitely people who are very passionate about what they believe there.
All right, so let's kind of dive into more of the Mothman focus of the
this reason
interview.
We're here.
Yeah, exactly. So did you know anything about the Mothman before going into Point Pleasant?
Not a thing. I didn't even know it was a thing.
Missed opportunity, Jordan.
But the day I got there, LDS missionaries are split up into companionships, so you have a companion, so there's two of you. And so my companion, as soon as I got there, he started telling me everything about the Mothman, actually.
As a good person should.
He's like, Elder, I have stories to tell you. And I'm like, okay. Like what? And he begins to tell me, as we're driving kind of into actual Point Pleasant area, we were driving through what's called the TNT area, which is where there used to be old like bomb testing sites for World War II, and people still say, "Oh, there's untriggered landmines and all kinds of stuff out there," which isn't true. I doubt they would have that kind of thing on American soil that people could just accidentally wander into. But we're driving through there, and he starts telling me, "Oh yeah, so there's this thing, and it's called the Mothman, and everyone here believes in him." And if you start talking to anyone here about the Mothman, you'll get them to talk to you. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you say, hey, have you guys heard of the Mothman, or do you know who the Mothman is, or have you guys been to like the museum? People will tell you their whole life story and how it relates to the Mothman somehow.
That is so awesome. Obviously, it sounds like that the Mothman is just a huge part of the culture of Point Pleasant. And I know they actually have a festival in September where, weirdly enough, they have like a pancake eating contest and stuff like that. But do you remember the first time you were talking to someone from the city and they brought up Mothman? Like, I know you heard about him from your companion, but when was like the first time a native told you about them and their story?
Yeah, so the first time, I don't remember how long I had been there, but I just remember this guy. He didn't really seem like he was all the way there. He might have been drinking, who knows. But he kind of came up to us and he said, have you heard about the Mothman? Have you seen him?
Oh, man.
And we're like, yeah, man, we know what the Mothman is. He's like, I seen him too. I saw him yesterday. And we were like, really? He's like, yeah. And we're like, we saw him the other day too. Because you just kind of have to go along with it, especially when you tell someone's inebriated or something like that. You don't really want to make them mad.
That is amazing.
That was probably the first time I recall someone approaching me and just talking about the Mothman and wanting to know if we had seen him.
Awesome. So you said people talk about him a lot. Are people constantly saying that they've seen him and all of that? Or is it just kind of something that everyone talks about but no one really believes? Does that make sense?
It's hard to tell because I'm sure there are plenty of people who just kind of see it as kind of pop culture, some kind of, just fun conversational piece. They don't really believe that he exists, but they like to talk about him because it's a fun thing, especially for people who aren't from there.
Sure.
They love to talk to him because it's something that's unique to them. No one else has a Mothman. No one else has a Mothman statue downtown right across from their city hall. So it's something they can be kind of proud of and that is very unique to them, that they get excited about, even if they may not believe it is real or not.
And talk to us about kind of both the statue and the museum. In particular, the museum. I want to know everything that was in that stupid place.
Yeah, so it was several years ago, so I don't remember everything that was in it, but I did have the opportunity to actually go through, and the guy who owned it let us go through for free. Normally you have to pay, but he let us come through, and they've got a few things that kind of highlight the movie, the Mothman Prophecies, and then there's also a documentary that they did about it that's separate, and they have some TVs kind of going that have information about those, but then they have all kinds of artifacts and things that have been claimed to be part of the Mothman or look like they could have been part of the Mothman, or things that were owned by people who were on the bridge when it collapsed, because the Mothman has this unique tie to the Silver City Bridge collapse that happened in, I think it was 1967.
Yep,
right
December 14th.
People swear that they saw the Mothman on top of that bridge right before it collapsed. And we met a lady whose husband died on that bridge. And to this day, she still believes that the Mothman was on that bridge right before it collapsed.
Wow. And that's kind of the lore of the Mothman and I apologize, it was December 15th, 1967, that they would see this creature, this red-eyed, glowing monster, essentially, with a 10-foot wingspan. And typically something bad would happen afterwards. And really the culmination of everything was the Silver Bridge that collapsed. And 46 people died. It was a big thing. Did you hear anybody else who knew anybody on the bridge or experienced that? I mean, 1967 is really not that long ago.
Yeah, no, I don't remember anyone specifically. I'm sure we ran into some people who either knew of or had some kind of relation to someone who was there. But I do remember this one lady in particular, because she was a widow and she just hadn't been married since then. She never remarried. And I think she said they had just been married that week. So they hadn't been married very long, yeah.
Did she give you any inclination of what she thought the Mothman was? Because some people think it is kind of a cryptozoid, which is like Bigfoot. It's just an undiscovered animal. Others say it's a demon or even an alien. Did she give any inclination of what she thought it was?
I don't remember if I don't want to speak for her, but I don't remember exactly what she believed he was. I know what I think he was, if he did really exist, but that's not related to her.
Well,
But-
we're getting there, Jordan, so don't you worry.
Okay.
Do you have any other stories from people who may have mentioned Mothman or experiences that you can remember other than the statue, the museum, and this lady?
It's not necessarily related to someone who was from there, but I did have the opportunity to show my mission president, who is kind of in charge of all the missionaries in that area. He came and visited us for an afternoon, came and had lunch with us, and we asked him, "Hey, President, have you heard of the Mothman? Have you ever seen it?" And he's like, "No, I don't think I have." And we said, "Well, before you go, you have to come see the statue." And we went down to the statue and got pictures with him, and it was like the envy of all the other missionaries. Whenever I'd show them my picture with the mission president in front of the Mothman, they're like, "No way, that's not real." And I'm like, "Oh yeah."
And for those who don't know, like, mission presidents are supposed to be kind of like the spiritual guide for all of these young missionaries in the area. Like, you look up to these men, and they're very, sometimes stoic, sometimes very approachable, but very spiritual, religious men. And so I can't imagine how, like, paradoxical that must have been to have this guy at this crazy statue of the Mothman.
Yeah, no, and he was a funny guy too. But I'm looking at the picture right now, and he's like holding his hand, like as we're taking the picture.
Oh, that's
He's like
amazing.
reaching up, holding his hand.
All right, let's get into the nitty gritty, Jordan. Let's hook you up to a polygraph and see what you think.
Oh
Do
boy!
you believe in the Mothman?
So I believe that if he was a real entity, that he wasn't some mythical being. I think he was some kind of government project where they were experimenting with like jetpack propulsion or something
Okay.
like that, and he had like some kind of suit. If he was a real being, I think he was some kind of government experiment suit that maybe someone had stolen, maybe someone had used unofficially, and
Love it.
they couldn't stop him for a while, and finally, like, all of these bad things happened, and then finally they were able to catch him and stop him. But that's what I think. I don't even know if there's any kind of evidence to support that, but that would make more sense to me than some bug creature that is the size of the Rock, flying around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, harassing people, on a Friday night when they're drinking too much. Like,
So that is fascinating. I've never heard kind of that theory, and I think it actually has quite a bit of credence. That who knows what the government has out there, and there's so much kind of conspiracy behind UFOs and technology and all of that. So I think it's a very plausible kind of idea. I love it. I don't know what I believe about the Mothman. I think he just needs a friend, and somewhere he, Bigfoot, and El Chupacabra are just playing cards and loving life, and hopefully not causing any other problems. In tandem with that, though, do you think that the Mothman had anything to do with the Silver Bridge? Is that just kind of coincidental, and kind of this Mothman paradigm gave the people of Point Pleasant something to have catharsis in? It was this terrible disaster, 46 people died. Instead of blaming the engineering or the construction of the bridge, let's blame this creature.
right. And like, I don't see how a single individual could cause that kind of collapse. I definitely think the bridge collapsed because of a fail of engineering, or just because it was getting old. Like, they actually, I can't remember if they reconstructed it or if there's just another part of the bridge that still exists that just trains go across now, and there's not like cars that go across it. But like, I don't think the Mothman was actually the reason. If he was, I don't think he did it alone.
More Mothmen. Moth women?
Well, maybe not more Mothmen. Maybe just like normal people who were involved. Who knows?
I think we have a shirt, though, in the making now that is just going to be, I am a Mothman. Mothman. I don't know. It's brilliant. All right. Well, Jordan, that's kind of all the questions we had for you today. Again, thank you so much. It's always fun to have people on our show that have real life experience with a lot of this stuff, and not everyone gets out to Point Pleasant, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been fun to talk about.
So your wife let me know. I am a big nerd. I love Blizzard. She said that you do a lot with Hearthstone. If people are interested in games like that, can they find you anywhere? We'd love to give you a social media blitz or
Yeah,
recommend people
so
to you.
yeah, so I do I have hosted a lot of Hearthstone events and other just esports events in general. And also lately I've been kind of streaming on Twitch TV kind of semi-frequently, a couple nights a week. So I have just my Twitter if you want to follow that. It's just Jordan Runyon. It's pretty straightforward, not hard to find. Jordan_Runyon. And then my Twitch is twitch.tv/Moadib, Mohadib. It's kind of a nod to the old Dune movie/book, if you've ever read those. It's a classic sci-fi.
Yeah, we know what we're doing.
So,
awesome. Well, thanks again. We really appreciate it, Jordan.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me.
Oh, that was such a fun interview with Jordan. Thank you again, Jordan. Please, if you have any interest in his video gaming or his Twitch feed, definitely check out his tags that he dropped in the interview. Great guy.
Yeah, I am kind of bummed I didn't get to actually participate in the interview, but life comes at you fast.
That it does. All right, Nathaniel, before we wrap up and talk about staying spooky and all of that, let's dissect the Mothman story a little bit. I've kind of dropped little niblets of why I love the Mothman and why I think he's so popular. So if you'll allow me, I just kind of want to reiterify that a little bit more.
Go ahead.
So like I mentioned earlier, I think the Mothman speaks to a lot of people because we all have been camping or hiking or been alone in the dark, driving at night. We see something that maybe we can't explain. And logically, we want to, of course, push it aside and think of it as, just something weird that we saw. And Mothman, in particular, to me, at least, is one of the cryptozoid stories where multiple people claim that they saw something over the course of a year. So that isolated experience we have in the mountains or driving alone, you take that, and then what happens if 100 people in your city say they saw the same thing you did? It definitely kind of changes the feeling of what you saw. And so for me, that's why I love the Mothman, is because you have Bigfoot and you have a Chupacabra, Jersey Devil, Loch Ness, and all of these acclaimed monsters that we have in the world. Nothing, I think, comes quite as close to Mothman, because all of these sightings happened within a year, and then we didn't hear really from Mothman until 1999 with the Russia apartment bombings. And I don't know, I think there is a pull there that the other monsters out there, the other creatures, don't have. It's kind of a novel situation that just doesn't exist everywhere. Even with alien abductions and sleep paralysis and all of that, it was an isolated event that, yeah, we could probably explain through science and rationality. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that? Would you agree? Do you disagree? What draws you to the Mothman, Nathaniel?
I think at the end of the day, the thing that draws me to the Mothman is the inherent ridiculousness of it. I love cryptids because they are, in most cases, kind of off the wall absurd. We have Loch Ness Monster, which is basically a dinosaur in Scotland. We have
Jersey Devil, which is a flying goat man.
Yeah, exactly. There's Goatmen, there's Sasquatch, which is, some big ape-like man thing running around that apparently, we can spot it, but we can't ever actually get a good picture of it, heaven forbid. There's the chupacabra, the goat sucker, which is probably just a deranged coyote. Like there's just so many things about cryptids that like I love them. I find them interesting, but what I love about them is that they are absurd, but people say that they saw them and have interacted with them or were attacked by them. And like that's I don't know. Like part of me wants these things to be real because like what could be greater than like a crazy moth guy who like is attracted to disasters, who like flies around and like freaks out people like horny teenagers in their cars.
It sounds like a Pokemon entry, like this moth creature that always appears when there's something dangerous about to happen. Like you say, it's just so bonkers.
And like I love that kind of thing. Like to me, the bonkersness of it, the fact that like I can go in deep and I can like take it seriously and I can do lots of research about it. Like I can spend hours digging into the Mothman, but at the end of the day, it's probably a big frickin' owl that people saw, and like that's fine. Just like to me, like all of the lore, all of the things that people pour into these things is just inherently fascinating to me. And also, like I love that I can laugh about it, but also go down some crazy internet rabbit holes of research.
I do want to make the caveat that I am, by education, a biologist. My degree is in zoology. And so as a biologist, as a zoologist, I cannot make the claim that, we know for certain that there are certain kinds of animals, if they're giant owls or giant ape men, whatever they may be, exist. But I think that's bad science to have an absolute they do not exist, but I think what we're lacking is a lot of scientific evidence of, I don't think it's a giant Mothman that is chasing after people and causing natural disasters to happen. I think it might be an undiscovered species of owl, of, or stork or heron or some kind of bird. We just don't have all the facts. And like you say, because we're missing those facts, people go crazy with it, and that's the fun thing about cryptozoids.
Yeah, and like in this case, I'm guessing it's probably one that was, migrating. Like it's one that isn't indigenous to the area, which is why people, when they encountered it, didn't immediately go, "Oh, it's this thing." It must have been introduced artificially or whatever. It could be navigating and ended up getting trapped for a year. Who knows? But we have a weird bird or a group of weird birds that are flying around. They're real big. They look kind of freaky. They have really reflective eyes. People are real scared of them for a while. That they get out of the area. It happens to coincide with this bridge collapsing. Things move on. And then, like that's what I'm guessing he is. But I don't know that. It really could be the Mothman. Who knows? And at the end of the day, I love not knowing that answer.
Okay, I think that does about it for Mothman. Do you have anything else, Nathaniel?
Just want to know how you're staying spooky.
I'm staying spooky with a new horror film that I found on Shudder. I also found it on the up-and-coming horror social media app Slasher. There was a lot of talk about a movie called Z. The letter Z. And we watched it together, Nathaniel, and it was pretty good.
Yep.
Slasher, they were talking a lot about how it was one of the scariest movies they've ever seen, and one person like vocally screamed in the movie, which I think that is a little crazy. It wasn't that scary.
Yeah, like it was a creepy movie, but it wasn't.
The plot was very well developed. They had a lot of good practical effects mixed with special effects. Essentially, it was an imaginary friend retelling. Kid has an imaginary friend who starts to do some very bad things. Come to find out, the imaginary friend is actually after the mother of the kid. And it spirals from there.
Spoiler.
I won't. Yeah, sorry. You can kind of see it coming, though. Let's be honest. It was pretty good. We may or may not do an episode on it in the future, but if you have a Shudder subscription, it's one of their better movies.
Yeah, it's a Shudder original, and it's fun.
They usually do a pretty good job, but this one is a little bit higher tiered than what they usually put out. How about you, Nathaniel? What are you doing?
So I have just recently started watching the 50 States of Fright Quibi series. So if you're not familiar with Quibi, it's like a phone-only streaming service. The only reason I am subscribing to it is because I can get it free through T-Mobile. So if you have T-Mobile, get it for free because free. But basically, it is a horror anthology series, and each episode is kind of split into 2 or 3 parts. Each part is like 8 minutes long, thereabouts. So each overall story ends up being like 15 to 30 minutes max. Each one is set in a different state. It's trying to have different filmmakers with each one. I've only watched the first one, which is called like Golden Arm or The Golden Hand or something like that. It was actually directed by Sam Raimi, so they definitely got some big horror names for that one. And yeah, so they're trying to showcase just a lot of different horror actors, a lot of horror directors and writers. It's fun. It's basically if you like fun horror anthology series, a la Tales of the Crypt. But this one is specifically made to be shorter, much more kind of consumable in a short period of time. And yeah, like they are doing a good job. Like the effects are pretty good, the acting's pretty good. They even have some kind of like fairly big hitters in terms of actors. We have Ming-Na Wen, who I know as Disney's Mulan from the original Mulan, and also she's in Agents of Shield. We have like favorite child actor Lulu Wilson is in an episode. We have Taissa Farmiga in one. I don't know, it's a pretty good spread of horror people and some other actors who are not in horror usually, making a fun series. So definitely, if you have Quibi, check it out. Maybe just get a free trial to Quibi. I think there's like a 30-day thing. Maybe wait until the season's done and then watch all of them in a short period of time. Yeah, that's how I've been staying spooky.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in. We've had a blast this episode. Make sure you're staying safe. It's a crazy time we're living in. And also, most importantly, stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at ScreamKingsPod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/ScreamKings. Stay spooky.